Hello again, and welcome back to part 2 of chapter 2 on media effects. We're going to talk now about not research theories, but about ways in which media researchers look at other content. In other words, methods of researching media effects as done by people that do it for a living, like teachers like me. So the first one I want to talk about is called content analysis. And I'm most familiar with this area because I did my master's thesis by doing a content analysis. And the cover of my thesis is there on the screen. And this is the short title, The Controversy Over Post-1960 Alternative American Reportage, a genre analysis of Tom Wolfe's candy-colored new journalism. Now, Tom Wolfe was an American writer who became prominent in the 1950s and early 1960s and is still active and writing novels today. In the early 1960s, he wrote a book in which he analyzed what was happening on the pop culture scene in America in the area around 1960, 1962. So in order to analyze the effect of his writing on the field of literature and the field of journalism itself, I did a content analysis of that book. So as I've written here, content analysis often involves studying one or more related artifacts, and the artifact in this case was a single book. But it can include books, movies, advertisements, speeches, television series, children's cartoons, and etc. And it is an analysis of the content, just like it says, using one or more media theories. Remember all those media theories that we talked about in part 1? And the analysis is written with an eye toward explaining the effect that the artifact has had on culture. So when I got done, I had about 177-page book myself on what this particular book meant, both literally interpreting it and also its effect on how it changed journalism for good in the 1960s and led on to the work of other authors like Hunter S. Thompson and things like that, people like that. So a content analysis is just simply, probably the most straightforward way to explain it is simply analyzing a piece of content. And you've done this before in your courses. Probably somebody's given you something that said analyze this, and you have to infer what does it mean. What are its obvious meanings, its symbolic meanings, its hidden meanings, and what change did it cause to world, if any. So that's the simplest way of doing what I did, explaining it. Of course, it took the better part of 2 years to do it, in addition to doing lots of other things. But a lot of these types of things are done often by people all the way up from beginning classes like this one, all the way up through the end of graduate studies. Another method is archival research, and often this is done in conjunction with lots of other types of research. And it really can be any study that involves using media that's been archived for historical purposes. You know, libraries are constantly throwing out old newspapers, old magazines. I mean, they've gone so far as to throw out like 100 years worth of the New York Times or something like that, physical paper copies, because they've been archived on various forms of media. So a lot of times, in order to get research done, you have to go to old newspapers, magazines, radio and television recordings. Government documents are often used. And a lot of those documents that are not physically available anymore are now housed on the internet. If they are not, and if someone's just thrown away that historical record and there is no archive of something, then it's very frustrating to researchers. And if you do any genealogy yourself, you've the little image that I've shown here is the 14th census of the U.S. and the 1920 census. If you have found that some archival records or records that should have been archived are not available, then you've essentially lost history. And media researchers bemoan that. I mean, they want to hold on to every scrap of paper they can and every document and photograph they can, because there'll be a time when all the paper goes away, and some of the stuff that may go away may not get archived in time. But if somebody says they're doing archival research, this means they're going back and really deeply looking as far back as they can for documents, photographs, images, maps, and things like that. Surveys are another common way of researching, using research to do media effects theory. There are two main types of surveys. The first is a descriptive survey. These are basically to establish the current state of affairs, like public opinion or consumer preferences. You're all familiar with that. You've all taken tons of surveys. If you bought a new appliance or a new car, if you're old enough to have done that, probably a condition of getting the warranty on the product of something like that, or a new camera, is you fill out a survey that tells them more information you'd want to reveal about not only your age and gender and things like that, but where you go to church, or what kind of church you are, how much do you earn, do you have any military service, are you married, are you single, and part of that is demographic research, so that they can get a pattern of who the consumers are who are buying their product or service, and part of it is a way to establish what's going on compared to past surveys. There are also what are called analytical surveys, and they go much further than descriptive surveys. You're really trying to establish that relationship between the media consumption, lifestyles, and habits of consumers. And it's not mentioned in the textbook, but these are sometimes called VALS, V-A-L-S, value surveys. They're trying to figure out, well, if you are a consumer and if you're in a particular bracket for age and income, are you more or less likely to own a second home or buy a boat? Things like that. And so on a most surface level, these types of surveys will establish how you feel about either the current state of affairs or how you might live your life or intend to live your life in the future. Rhetorical analysis is a key form of a key method of doing research. Basically, it's about attempts to understand how media messages work and why some are more effective than others. So this, as you might imagine, takes place a lot in product advertising and advertising in general. So there are attempts to study the words primarily, but also images of presentation styles to decide what advertising might be most effective. And I put an example there. It's not really a great example, but I just decided which of the below is better and why. And then I realized you could pick one or the other, and that's partly what somebody who's doing an analysis would want to find out. How would you explain why one is better than the other? So there is no right answer there. Is it the car? Is it the SUV body going on top of the what kind of animal is that? Rhinoceros? Or is it the hunter who's peeping over the truck bed and getting ready to shoot a buffalo or something like that? That's a tiny buffalo. I don't know what that is. So rhetorical analysis is also related to content analysis in the sense that how somebody says something, how persuasive they are, and what way they say it can determine, by studying, can determine which method or which way of pursuing other research goes. Focus groups, you've probably heard of focus groups. I put just a long paragraph here describing them because there's a lot of points. The photograph shows a focus group in a room, it's all sitting around in chairs, and it's very likely that that room is wired for sound and video both. Sound just as a backup to the video with sound. That's probably a one-way mirror. because and often it's the case that focus groups are evaluated anonymously, how they interact. These people in the foreground are listening, taking notes, and observing body language. Looks to me that the woman on the right there, that picture in the room, is writing on some kind of a whiteboard or a piece of easel or something, and she may be have self-designated as a group leader, or maybe it pointed out to be the one who writes down all the ideas that they come up with. You notice one chair is empty. So they gather a group of participants, and usually people are asked to be in focus groups. They're called or written, and it's randomly generated. I don't know if any of you are asked to be in a focus group, but generally they just, if they have them here in Wichita and here in the Elliott School, we do them for clients. They're asked to come in, and they're not usually told in advance what they're going to be talking about. When I was growing up in grad school, we were taught that discussions are not guided, but nowadays it seems to be the case that they frequently are. And I'll give you an example here in a minute. The group is recorded, they're remotely observed. The responses generated by the group are meant to replicate a cross-section of the public in which is being studied for the most part. And usually, it's almost always the case that people who agree to take part in a focus group are paid. It may be $10 or $20. It's not a whole lot of money, but it's enough to lure people away from their home. So, for example, an unguided focus group question might be someone going into the room and starting the discussion by simply saying, "Talk about what you eat for breakfast," and then leaving. And the group is sort of self-motivated, self-driven after that point. Let's say the customer is actually somebody who wanting to try out or put out a new breakfast cereal. But you don't go in and say what kind of breakfast cereals you want or what do you like in a breakfast cereal. You just tell the group, talk about what you like for breakfast, or will you eat breakfast. Well, some people say, well, I don't eat breakfast. And the other people in the group are going to say, well, I always have bacon and eggs and hash browns and 3 mugs of coffee and all this stuff. The idea, because the narrator or the group starter has left, the idea is to let them discuss whatever they want. That's open-ended. It's not guided. And so eventually someone is probably going to get around to saying, well, I always have a big bowl of Cheerios in the morning, and then people talk about what cereal they like and what they don't, and how they hate one kind of cereal and they can't stand oatmeal. And the whole idea is that after a certain amount of time, 20 or 30 minutes, somebody comes back into the room and says, thank you very much, here's your $20 check and for participating. And the participants are never really told whether their answers helped or didn't help the group. A guided discussion goes a little further than that, in that there's someone who stays in the room and starts asking broad questions like, what do you eat for breakfast, or do you eat breakfast? Eventually steers them around by asking smaller and more detailed focused questions. Well, what about breakfast cereal? Well, do you like the kind that are sugary or not? And guides the discussion the groups has. And some people, that seems to be the norm now, because it means that the results are going to be gotten to more quickly. But there's always that problem of things like spiral of silence, where somebody's sitting there thinking they want to say something, but doesn't, because the majority of the group's all agreeing that Kellogg's Corn Flakes are the best. So really long discussion of focus groups. They're fascinating, and if you've ever been in one, it can be a really fascinating experience. Number 6, what we're called controlled experiments. Just like a scientific experiment, participants or people that you're studying are exposed to certain types of media, and you study the effects of exposure to that media. And one example is, this kind of a thing is fairly common. You pick 50 people and you divide them into 2 groups of 25, and you show them essentially the same film, but one contains pornography and the other one has had the pornography edited out. And neither audience knows that. They don't know anything except they're watching this film. Afterward, they're asked to fill out surveys and questionnaires. answer questions, maybe do a focus group. And the idea is to try to, through those follow-up questions and focus groups, find out how differently the audiences react. What are their written and spoken comments? What conclusions can be reached? This Hollywood does this all the time, and not just for pornography. They show various screenings trying to get people to decide what endings for a movie that they prefer. And sometimes they agree with the audience that they're asking, and sometimes they go against that. So that's it. The second version here were just some methods, ways in which the media itself, researchers themselves use theory to try to find out more about culture and climate, and for better or worse. And I appreciate you sticking through with this and watching the chapter.